The legend of the Wendigo has been terrifying America for centuries. A creature of endless hunger, a spirit of winter and cannibalism, a monster said to haunt the frozen forests of the north. I became interested in this legend when I was growing my YouTube horror narration channel and realized that stories about supposed encounters with Wendigos were the most popular. Prior to discovering the stories on Reddit, I'd never heard about them. Yet, my audiences found them to be the most engaging and scary stories. They couldn't get enough of them. So in this Tales of High Strangeness case file, I'm asking the questions: why did people once fear the Wendigo so deeply? And why are people so fascinated by the legend today? And perhaps more importantly, was the Wendigo ever just a monster from folklore? Or was it something much more real? I'm James Deverell. Welcome to THS Case Files. Most modern audiences today encounter the Wendigo through movies, games, or internet horror art, usually depicted as a skeletal creature with antlers stalking the woods. But when you trace the legend back to its roots, something surprising happens. The Wendigo isn't just folklore or a scary story. It's a warning, a moral one, a cultural system meant to explain what happens when survival instincts override humanity itself. And once you look at the historical records, the legend becomes even darker. Because there were real people in history who were accused of becoming Wendigos. Real communities feared them. And people actually lost their lives because of those fears. To understand the Wendigo, we have to start with language. The word itself comes from several Algonquin-speaking indigenous communities across northern North America, including Ojibwe and Cree peoples. In Ojibwe, the term Wendigo translates roughly to a winter cannibal monster. In Cree traditions, a related term, Whitikau, doesn't just describe a monster, it can also mean a cannibal, or even a greedy person. And this particular detail is important, because the Wendigo isn't only about the consumption of humans, it's about consuming more than your share, taking from others when survival depends on cooperation. In harsh northern winters, communities relied on each other. Food shortages could wipe out entire families, and in those conditions, selfishness wasn't just immoral, it was deadly. The Wendigo became the embodiment of what happens when hunger destroys empathy. Across many traditions, the story goes something like this. A person resorts to cannibalism during extreme famine. But once they cross that line, something changes. Their hunger grows. They become obsessed with consumption, never satisfied, never full. In some versions, the person transforms physically, growing into a monstrous being with frozen skin and an insatiable appetite. In others, the change is psychological, a human who has lost their humanity. Either way, the message is the same. When survival becomes selfishness, everyone suffers. Now, here's where the story shifts from folklore to documented history. The earliest written mentions of the Wendigo don't come from storytelling, they come from colonial trade posts. At the time, much of northern North America was being mapped and exploited by European fur trading companies. One of the most powerful of these was the Hudson's Bay Company, founded in 1670, which controlled vast territories and built remote trading forts across what is now Canada. These posts became meeting points between European traders and indigenous communities, and their employees kept detailed journals about weather trade and local events. In one of these journals, in 1714, a Hudson's Bay Company clerk recorded a strange word: Wendigo, described as an apparition connected to winter haunts. And the journal doesn't describe a monster the way horror stories do today. Instead, it records Wendigo as an apparition, something feared in the winter wilderness. To the traders writing these logs, it was simply a strange local belief influencing winter hunting. But what they were unknowingly documenting was one of the earliest written traces of a much older indigenous warning about hunger, survival, and what people can become when desperation takes hold. A brief note in a trading ledger, but one that would become part of a legend that survived centuries. A few decades later, another entry described a horrifying event. A man, during winter isolation, murdered and consumed members of his own family. He was eventually killed by relatives who feared what he had become. And what makes this record unsettling is that the journal notes something unexpected. There was food available, which means starvation alone might not explain the violence. Fear, desperation, or belief may have played a role. And this wouldn't be the last time Wendigo fears entered official records. One of the most infamous cases connected to Wendigo fears unfolded in the late 1800s on the frozen frontier of what is now Alberta. A Cree trapper known as Swift Runner lived with his wife and children near Fort Saskatchewan. Like many families at the time, they spent winters isolated, relying on hunting and stored supplies to survive months of brutal cold. Then, one winter, the family vanished. When authorities finally discovered Swift Runner months later, he was alone. His wife and children were gone. At first, his explanation seemed tragically familiar for the era. He claimed his family had starved to death during the winter, and that in desperation he had consumed their bodies to survive. But investigators quickly noticed troubling details. Swift Runner did not look like a starving man. He appeared strong, healthy, well-fed. And even more disturbing, food supplies and game animals were available not far from where he had been living. Fort Saskatchewan itself was within reachable distance, meaning help may not have been as far away as he claimed. As authorities investigated further, a darker truth emerged. His family hadn't died naturally, they had been killed, one by one, and then consumed. The case shocked both settlers and the indigenous communities alike. Newspapers sensationalized the story, and colonial authorities portrayed it as monstrous violence. But within local communities, another explanation circulated. Some believed Swift Runner had become a Wendigo, a man whose hunger had grown beyond control, someone overtaken by the terrifying transformation long warned about in winter stories. Today, historians will still debate what truly happened. Was it starvation mixed with desperation? Psychological collapse during isolation? Violence later interpreted through cultural fears? Or something else entirely? What we know for certain is this. The case permanently linked real-world tragedy with the growing legend of the Wendigo in colonial imagination. It marked a moment when survival horror, criminal investigation, and indigenous belief collided in a way that would shape how the Wendigo was understood for generations. A few years after the Swift Runner case, fear surfaced again, this time farther north in the remote lake country of northern Alberta. Winter was settling in when a man began to fall ill. Accounts describe him as growing increasingly unstable. His behavior changed. He became unpredictable, agitated, and frightening to those around him. In isolated communities, illness was never just personal, it threatened everyone. A sick hunter or trapper could mean families went hungry. A violent or unstable individual in winter conditions could put entire camps at risk. And soon, whispers began spreading through the settlement. People feared the man was becoming a Wendigo. Community members tried to help him. Traditional healers were consulted. Spiritual remedies and treatments were attempted. People tried to calm him, restrain him, restore balance before things escalated further. But his condition reportedly worsened. Fear grew. Families worried about what might happen if his behavior turned violent or if hunger and isolation drove him toward cannibalism. The transformation everyone dreaded. And eventually, the community made a terrible decision. Believing they were facing a deadly threat, they killed him. From a modern perspective, it's easy to see this as a tragedy born of misunderstanding. But historians studying the event emphasize something crucial. The community did not believe they were executing a sick man. They believed they were preventing a catastrophe. Within their worldview, a Wendigo was unstoppable once the transformation was complete. Acting early meant protecting children, elders, and entire families from unimaginable violence. To them, this was not cruelty or survival. And modern scholars admit something uncomfortable. We may never know what illness or condition the man truly suffered from. The medical records are sparse or non-existent. Colonial accounts filtered events through their own misunderstandings. But what we do know is how the community understood the situation. Through the legend of the Wendigo. A language for explaining fear, imbalance, and the terrifying possibility that someone could become a danger to those they loved. And this case shows something chilling. By the late 1800s, fear of the Wendigo had transcended from folklore. It could determine life or death situations. Throughout the late 1800s, several similar events were recorded, communities fearing individuals would transform, authorities intervening, newspapers sensationalizing events, and colonial law clashing with indigenous beliefs about community protection. In some cases, like the story of Jack Fiddler, people were charged for the killing of those believed to be Wendigos. The courts didn't recognize indigenous legal systems or survival logic. To colonial authorities, these were murders, but to communities, they were acts of survival. So, what was really happening? Were these isolated tragedies, mental illness misunderstood, or was something else going on? This debate led to one of anthropology's most controversial topics, Wendigo psychosis. Some researchers claimed certain individuals developed a culture-bound disorder, a fear of becoming a cannibal, or an uncontrollable desire to eat human flesh. Others argued this diagnosis was deeply flawed. The colonial observers misunderstood cultural beliefs and projected psychiatric labels onto complex social situations. Modern scholars remain divided, but many do agree on one thing. The safest claim isn't that people became monsters, it's that communities used Wendigo beliefs to explain and respond to crisis. The Wendigo was social law, a warning system, a way to keep communities alive during unimaginable hardship. However, something changed in the early 20th century. In 1910, British horror writer Algernon Blackwood published a chilling wilderness tale titled The Wendigo, introducing the legend to English-speaking horror audiences and helping transform a culturally rooted warning into a modern horror icon. And from there, the legend entered Western horror fiction. Over time, movies and video games transformed the creature. The all-too-familiar antlers were added to the monster. The story moved away from winter survival and into supernatural horror. Eventually, internet culture cemented the now familiar deer skull monster. But this version isn't universal, it's modern horror interpretation, not traditional teaching. The deeper meaning, warnings of greed, isolation, survival, often get lost. So I believe it's important to remember the Wendigo isn't just entertainment. For many indigenous communities, these stories are part of living cultural systems. So, when we talk about the Wendigo, we should do so respectfully, recognizing its origins, avoiding sensationalism, and understanding that these stories once helped people survive real dangers.